tumaganap, kinaskumon, kinaskum tinuwa, kaktiyaw. Pag-imawa, kinaskum tinuwa, square nabara, ano tayo ng cemento, kinaskum tinuwa. My friends and relatives, a little bit, I'm very happy to be here, and thank you all for coming, the men and women, the leaders that are here, the chiefs. I also acknowledge our Creator for this beautiful day again here. This morning, again, I wanted to talk about what happened yesterday in terms of the budget. And I want to say that First Nations peoples in this country have worked long and hard to set in motion a plan to close the gap in terms of the quality of life that our people endure and the quality of life other Canadians enjoy. The budget introduced by the Government of Canada yesterday shows that this government is listening. They understand that an investment in First Nations is an investment in Canada. This budget begins the process of addressing decades of underfunding and neglect. And at long last, we have a budget that will help to lift those with the greatest need out of poverty. I've constantly pointed this out, that while Canada as a country ranks 6th in terms of the quality of life according to the United Nations Human Development Index, 6th up here, when you apply those same indices to Indigenous peoples, we're 63rd down here. So it's 6th versus 63rd. And that gap represents everything we continually talk about as leaders. That gap represents the high youth suicide rate amongst our people. That gap represents the 1,200 missing murdered Indigenous women and girls. That gap represents the 132 boil water advisories. That gap represents the overcrowded housing and the black mold in our homes. That gap represents the discriminatory funding for on-reserve child care and family services. It also represents the inequity in terms of education funding. And it also represents the disproportionate number of our people in jails. So that gap is huge. And I've always said, if nothing is done and investments aren't made, maintaining the status quo is not acceptable. And there's a high burden and cost to maintaining the status quo. Closing the employment and education gap between Indigenous peoples and other Canadians will add billions to the economy and also save billions in social costs. And according to the Centre for the Study of Living Standards, if Canada would have done this in 2010, that by the year 2025, $400 billion in GDP would be added to Canada's economy, and $125 billion would be saved in social spending. This is a budget that is good for all of Canada. These investments will bring long-needed relief to those living in third world conditions in our own country. New investments and a new nation-to-nation relationship promised by this government will create the path forward for strong First Nations and a more prosperous Canada. But you know, the needs are great. The needs are tremendous. And they've been called out by many. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, the Supreme Court of Canada, in some 200 decisions that we have won, recognized inherent Aboriginal and treaty rights. And just this past month, the United Nations Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights again found Canada coming up short with respect to the fundamental human rights of Indigenous peoples. So this budget is an important step in beginning to address these injustices. This budget invests in things that all Canadians believe in for everyone. Good quality homes, good affordable homes, good quality education for our kids, for our children, education for our kids, for our children. Access to clean water, and dealing with child welfare, and addressing the worst levels of poverty in this country. So this is a budget that responds to our call to close the gap. It does so by making smart investments in our shared future. Investing in human capital is the best economic stimulus plan for Canada. investing in human capital. And we all know that young First Nations men and women are the fastest growing segment of Canada's population. Fastest growing segment. And this budget, it makes a brighter future possible for First Nations peoples, and that's good for everyone. Investing in First Nations is the best economic stimulus plan that will lead to a more prosperous Canada for us all.